Tonight's speaker, Jenn Diaz. She will be speaking about what my coding bootcamp didn't teach me, and a little bit about Jenn. She works for the Wanderlust Group, an outdoor travel technology company, as a junior software engineer. And in her role, Jenn writes code in Rails and React to maintain and develop TWG's 3 products, each of which helps connect adventurers to the outdoors. In 2020, before starting at TWG, Jenn completed the Flatiron full stack software engineering immersive. And with that, Jenn, I will pass it off to you.
Thank you. I appreciate the intro. Let's get the presentation up here. All right, awesome. Looks good. Cool. So I wanted to start with just a little bit to where this presentation came from and what kind of sparked this idea. So when you finish a boot camp, especially if you're active on LinkedIn, you'll find that lots of people start reaching out to you. And I started noticing some of those questions repeating. And one of the ones that I never quite had a good answer for was, did your boot camp adequately prepare you for your role? My answer was always sort of, well, it kind of did. So I wanted to dig more onto what I meant by that and hopefully answer some of the questions, such as what do you actually learn in a coding boot camp and what should I be learning now that I've completed a boot camp and I'm in my job search. And then, so a little icon in the corner here. I use this throughout the slides to indicate bullet points that are good things to note for things to learn or tips to get better at a specific topic. So if you see that throughout, that's what it's indicating. And again, a little bit more about me. My name is Jennifer Grenier Diaz, and my pronouns are she and her, and I work as a junior software engineer for the Wanderlust Group. I work remotely, so I am based in Fort Collins, Colorado. I work on a full stack team, and I work mostly with Rails and React, and I'm particularly passionate about working on projects that let me advocate for inclusivity and accessibility within code. I have a previous career in outdoor recreation management, so I was really stoked that my first role in tech got to kind of bring some of that all together. And then outside of my job, I also volunteer with Women Who Code, and I co-host that monthly tech night that was mentioned earlier, so I hope to see some of you there. And then outside of tech, I really love doing things outside and taking advantage of everything that's around me in Colorado. I'm a cyclist. I enjoy skiing, reading. I picked up embroidery during the pandemic. And then my favorite way to unwind after a really long day of coding is with really bad reality TV. Favorite ones recently are Ultimatum and Is It Cake? I don't know where they find these people, but they make for some really good TV. And then a little bit more about my bootcamp experience. So I attended the Flatiron coding bootcamp from August to November of 2020. And thinking back to where the world was at that point, this was kind of when things were shutting down with the pandemic. So while I signed up for an on-campus program, it was fully remote. I think for the first 3 months, they were saying 2 more weeks, and it just kept being 2 more weeks. So I had to be pretty flexible and adjust to my on-campus being what you see here on the right, my desk and 2 monitors. I did receive a partial scholarship for my boot camp, and I mention this because I don't think boot camps necessarily do a good job of advertising that scholarships exist, and I think that's a really great way for it to be accessible for more people, and I know I wouldn't have been able to attend if that wasn't an option for me. And then after my boot camp, I actually had my first interview with TWG 2 minutes after my graduation finished. So it was quite a whirlwind. Interviewed with them over the next few weeks. And then I started a role with TWG in January of 2021. A little bit more about my current role. I work on a pretty small team. I think we're at 19 engineers now. And I work most closely with a group of 4 people. So it has a really small, intimate feel, and that may kind of affect the advice I give. So keep that in mind, that if you end up working at a really big company, the environment may be a little bit different. And then overview of presentation for tonight. So I do have a resource document that Jenn is going to share in the chat. Also, it's kind of, think of it like a companion guide. So as I go through the slides, you can follow along and see the resources that I recommend going to for more information. I'm going to start with some things I think my bootcamp got right, and then other things that I've had to learn more on the job that may be worth considering if you're wondering what to start learning next. And I have that broken down into technical skills and professional skills. Then I have a quick summary, and hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes for questions at the end. So starting with concepts that I think my bootcamp got right. So the first one, I think the base level intro knowledge of the tech stack they teach was appropriate for the amount of time and what we had to learn. So we learned Ruby and JavaScript and then added frameworks to that, so Rails and React. Next thing was, in my bootcamp, we had a final project, and we were required to include a technology that was not included in the curriculum in that final project. And that process of independently learning a new, for me, it was a framework, really kind of boosted my confidence leaving the bootcamp that I can learn new things and take what I've learned and apply it to other languages as well. And then this next one, this might sound a little silly, but an important thing I learned was how to learn how to code. So I have a very heavy academic background. I've got a bachelor's and a master's degree. And through those programs, I got really good at memorizing information and regurgitating it and turning that into a paper. And while that's a skill, it's probably not the best skill for learning how to code. So I had to really adjust how I learned to be successful. And the first technique I had for this was the idea of a build and burn. So that was creating a project really just for the sake of getting practice and reps in, and not necessarily trying to recreate Facebook, just, having a project for the sake of doing it. And then the next one, I sort of established a framework for myself for asking effective questions. So before I reach out and ask a question, I write down what my issue is, what kind of errors or code related things am I having, what have I tried so far, what have I Googled and found on my own. And then once I've done all that, I go ahead and I ask the question, and that not only helps me know that I have done my part in researching it, but also helps the person answering the question answer the question for me. And then the next one, working remotely. Again, this was a little bit of a side effect because it wasn't necessarily what I'd signed up for the bootcamp for, but this was my first time working at a computer all day and my first time working from home. So I had to pick up some traits to help me be successful in that. My favorite one was I had a snack shack, which you may have seen in the previous picture. There's a bag of popcorn in the corner. It really helped me to have snacks with me throughout the day. So if I was really tired during a class, they were right there. And I still do that today. I actually have to remind myself to mute sometimes so people don't hear me munching at my desk. And then writing good READMEs. So I bring this one up because it's one of the ways that I've seen applicants really stand out in their code exercises they submit for us. And I have a good resource that goes deeper into this, but the README is your first document that people see when they view your project on GitHub. And it's kind of your first opportunity to make a good first impression. Yeah, so definitely something if you're doing a code problem for an interview to have that in there. And then next, I just want to share some general advice from my bootcamp that really stuck with me, and there's still things that I reflect on today. So the first one is to not compare yourself to others. The people in your coding bootcamp and the people that you work with have different backgrounds from you. I work with people with CS degrees, I work with people who are self-taught, and I work with other bootcamp grads. And just keeping in mind that it's better for me to track my own progress instead of comparing it to other people's. And then a project is never done. This was really helpful kind of in the gap after my coding bootcamp, is that if you wait until you feel as if a project is totally done, you may never share it. So to have kind of a minimum viable product in mind and share it then, and then iterate on it and improve on it in small chunks. And then working in thin vertical slices. This was something our bootcamp really encouraged. It's tempting when you're new to build out your entire backend and then go and try and build out your entire front end. And this, it's not the best way to do it. And I think working in thin vertical slices helped prepare me to working in more of an agile environment. And then the next one, this one is particularly helpful after I've had a long day of coding, is just to remember that computers are rocks that we've tricked into thinking. And now moving into more of the skills that I think my bootcamp didn't include. And these are ones that either I think that they should include moving forward, or just ones that I think would be good skills to work on when you're in your job search. So the first one of those is web accessibility. And just a quick definition of that, it's the concept of the code that you write should be usable for people with disabilities, and not just usable, but they should also be able to contribute to and interact with the web. And then I included A11Y here because you'll see that in my resources, just a shorthand for accessibility. So accessibility is not only important for legal and business implications, but it's really become a basic human right. If you think of where we are in the world today, if you need information about getting a COVID test or a vaccine, or you need emergency information about a fire that might be nearby, if the code that you write to present that information isn't accessible, then there are people that are going to be missing out on that important information. And then I also think that web accessibility is something that's missed not just by boot camps, but by CS degrees. I've met senior engineers where it's a relatively new concept to them. And I think that's kind of why we see some of the issues with accessibility that we see today. And I could talk about this for the next 2 hours, but I'm not going to, because I linked in the resources to really good presentations from former Women Who Code presentations that would be good to look for if you're looking for an intro to web accessibility. But I do want to leave you with a couple tips on getting started with this. So how I originally got started with being aware of accessibility with the code I write is using an automated accessibility tool. And the one that I recommend starting with is the Wave Web Accessibility. It's an extension that I have on Chrome. And you run it on your site. On Mac, it's just Shift-Command-U to run it. And it has a little dashboard and kind of points out in your UI what might be potential accessibility issues, links to resources on how to fix it. And that's a really great way to start seeing initially as you're developing issues that may exist in your code. And then once you've gotten good with an automated tool, to start learning about manual testing. So this is interacting with your app in the way in which someone with a disability may interact with it. So it could be trying to navigate just using your keyboard, or trying to navigate with just your mouse, or even using a screen reader, and then identifying issues that may occur based on that. Yeah, and then as I've mentioned, go check out those other presentations for some more information. And the next one is the shell and writing scripts. So I did some of this in my bootcamp, but I don't think I really understood what I was doing or really how this could be powerful. So the shell is a textual interface that you use to interact with your computer. And then shell scripts is a series of shell commands written in a file. And an example of this that I did recently, we were taking a break from our normal workflow, and instead of working on new features, I was asked to kind of start paying down some of our tech debt. And one of my cards that I was assigned was to rename a number of our files. And I think it was like 80 or 90 files throughout our code base. And instead of going through and doing those all by hand, I wrote a script that went through and renamed all those files for me. So it really allows you to automate commands and repetitive tasks, and gets to be a little bit more efficient. So some ways to start working on this, I really recommend the missing semester of your CS education. It's put on by, I think, a couple professors at MIT, and goes a lot deeper into this and gives you some problems to work through to learn it as well. And then also starting to work on more complex projects, be those ones that maybe other bootcamp grads are started, or also consider finding an open source project that you can start contributing to. And then version control, Git and GitHub. So my bootcamp did have us using GitHub, but very basically. And I don't think I fully, again, just like the shell, I don't think I fully knew what I was doing. So a little bit more about what I mean by this. Version control, this is a system that tracks record changes to a file. And then GitHub is the Git is one of the more popular softwares used for tracking these changes. And then GitHub is the online platform where you store your files, and they're stored in a way in which other people can contribute to them as well. So something that I use every day as an engineer, really makes working collaboratively more efficient, and being able to do things like cherry picking and rebasing a branch and not having to Google what all of that means is a good skill, I think, for a junior engineer. Then some ways to start working on this: start practicing good Git habits early, specifically with commits, having small commits that you push up frequently, and having names that are more helpful than, wow, this was hard. So having a commit message that tells you what you're actually working on. And then just like the previous slide, try to start working on more complex projects. Consider a open source project if you can. And then something I started using at my current role is GitHub Desktop. So I think it's really important to know how to use the CLI to use GitHub, but GitHub Desktop puts a visual part to all of these commands. And it helped me understand what the commands were doing a little bit more. For example, if you're cherry picking commits from one branch to another, you literally just click and drag them over. And I think that was the first time that I really knew what that meant. And then again, the missing semester goes over this a little bit more as well. And then working on code that you didn't write. So when you're in a coding bootcamp, you're working primarily on code bases that you wrote yourself, or you may have been pairing with one or two other people, but you were in the room while all that code was being written. And when I first saw the size of the code base that I work on now, I was pretty intimidated. I do work on legacy code, so it's been started in 2015 till today. So there's a lot of complex things going on with dependencies and versions and external libraries that we're using. And having more experience doing this before you look at one in your first job can kind of have you be more prepared for that. An example of this, in my boot camp, we learned the most recent version of React, and I was working with class and functional-based components and using hooks. And I got to my current job and we're using a version of React that's a few years older, and we weren't using any hooks and all of our components were class-based. And that was pretty confusing at first. So knowing how to write something with a hook and then convert it into how you would do that beforehand. So some ways to work on this skill is to reference the documentation for a code base that you're working on, be that a README, or there may be other documentation that's not necessarily in the README. Hopefully it's linked in the README, but ask, because they may have it elsewhere. And then avoid the temptation to refactor code just for the sake of refactoring it. You may see a React component and say, oh, I could rework this with a hook and it would be more efficient. But if it's currently working and it's not related to what you're working on, sometimes it's better to leave it as it is. And then ask a lot of questions when you're looking at a new code base, and start documenting the answers to those questions. They will likely either help you later on, or when someone new joins the team, you'll be able to answer those questions for them a little bit quicker. And then again, like I've said a few times, start contributing to open source projects. Getting experience, opening a new code base that's big and navigating through it is a really good skill to have. And then the last one for our technical skills is testing your code. So I think that this is now in the curriculum, and it may have been during my time, but I didn't get to it. So we're going to pretend that Flatiron in 2020 did not teach testing your code. So my dumbed down definition as to what this means is it's code written to ensure your code is working. And this can get really complicated. So I'm going to be kind of surface level. Two most frequent types you'll hear discussed are unit tests and integration tests. So a unit test is a test written on an individual unit of code, think a function or a method. And then an integration test is a test that looks at those different units that are working together or interacting, and exposing any faults in that interaction. And then you'll see my little chart over here going through test-driven development. So this is the idea that you start by understanding your goal, you write a test for that, you have the test fail, write the code to pass the test, and then refactor the code. So some of the benefits of working in this way is that it's going to allow you to more quickly find and correct issues in your code. It helps the developer understand your requirements before you begin writing your code. And ultimately, it's going to result in a code base that has higher test coverage, because if you wait to do something at the end, it's less likely to get done. So some ways to start learning how to test your code is to add it to personal projects. And then again, start working on more complex projects. Most of the open source projects that I've started looking at have tests baked in already. So getting the experience of running those and seeing them fail and how to adjust them is a great skill to have. And now moving into more of the professional skills. The first one here is reading technical texts. So when I started my current job, I was encouraged to pick up Practical Object-Oriented Design by Sandy Metz, which is a great book. I would encourage you to pick it up as well if you work with Ruby. But I also found it pretty discouraging. It was pretty hard for me to get through. It's got some really dense concepts in there. And one of the things that I remind myself is that this is written for developers of all levels of experience. And I work with staff level engineers who are still trying to understand these concepts. I attended RubyConf last year, and I linked a presentation in that resource doc that it's actually from a former teacher that talks about how to understand what you're reading. But it was really impactful for me because I was in Pooter and, practical oriented design, abbreviates to Pooter. I was reading that and again, feeling discouraged. And one of the things he recommended is to create what I'm calling here a reading bookmark. And it just has a list of questions to kind of check my understanding and to reflect on as I'm reading to help me write notes that are good and think about how this applies to what I'm doing for work. So the questions I have on the bookmark for what I'm reading now, this is from the Well-Grounded Rubius, is do we do this at work and can I find an example of it? What questions do I have about this? Is this something that's new to me? And how is this different from code that I've written? And then another way to work through kind of these bigger texts is to read with other people. Find a book club to join or even start a book club with other Women Who Code members to work through texts that you guys may be interested in reading together. And then code reviews. So I think we touched on these in our boot camp, but we just automatically approved it because again, we were pairing with people and we're there while we were writing the code. And I found it's much different than that in the real world. So code reviews is the process of having your code checked by other developers prior to merging it into a project. And it's sort of two halves to this. As the author, you're the one who's taking the code, putting it in a pull request to be reviewed. And then as the reviewer, you're going through the code and giving feedback and suggestions. And as a new developer, this was really intimidating for me. I remember like starting to sweat as I pushed that create pull request button. But some things that have helped me with that is to remember that the idea of the code review is to make your code better. You don't have to, it doesn't have to feel perfect before you push it up there, and getting feedback on your code review isn't a good thing. Isn't a bad thing, excuse me. It's a good thing. It means that your coworkers are giving you good feedback and you're able to improve your code. I also think it's a great thing when you're interviewing to discuss. It's kind of a good indicator of company culture. If you ask about code reviews and someone says, well, that's where I like to be mean, then that's a good idea that maybe these aren't the best people to be working with. So some tips with this as the reviewer is to ask pointed questions instead of demanding a change. So instead of saying this div should be a p tag, you could say, is there a reason you used a div? Could we consider a p tag because it's more semantic? And then as the author, being grateful for suggestions and recognizing that intent and emotion doesn't always transfer online, and that assuming that people have good meaning behind that. And then lastly, contribute to an open source project. While it works at a much slower pace than it probably will in a workplace, getting that experience and putting together a pull request and getting feedback is valuable. And then next, structuring your workday. So I am fortunate enough that, again, I work at a pretty small team and I'm able to set my own schedule. I do have meetings that are weekly that I need to attend. But outside of that, I get to create things that work well for me. And this is great, but also has required me to be really intentional about how I set my day. You can see on the side here, I've got sort of a sample day in the life of Jenn as an engineer. I start with the first hour. I call this coffee time. So this is sort of my warm up for my day. I may be wrapping up tasks from yesterday. I work on some code problems through Code Wars with coworkers. So I'll do these in the morning, just sort of to get me thinking about coding, but not necessarily diving into the most complicated task that I'm currently working in. And then we have a weekly stand up, or I may have a planning meeting in the morning. Got some time for coding. And then lunch, I do actually write this in to make sure that I do take it and I don't, end up at 3 o'clock and I haven't eaten yet. And then more time for coding. And then I will also sometimes indicate when I have heads down time. So for me, this means time when I'm focusing on something that I really need all of my attention on. And I do communicate this through Slack or Google so that people know maybe not to ping me with a meme or something silly, and instead only to reach out if they absolutely need to. And then I may have another meeting in the afternoon, something like a design meeting, or sometimes we have social meetings worked in. And then more time in the afternoon for coding. Usually in the afternoon, I'll try and pair with someone else. Hopefully I get an afternoon walk with my dog in. And then the last hour I try to reserve for kind of wrapping up tasks. And I also summarize my notes from the day and kind of highlight things I learned that I may need to document. And then, so it's important not to skip your breaks, not just because it's good for your mental health, but it also, I think, really makes you a better engineer. I know a number of times I just walk to my front door and open the door and I have an idea of how to fix something I've been working on. So taking that time away from your computer really does help make you a better engineer. So then, in summary, I think my boot camp was a really vital, important step for me as my entry into tech. I also think you can successfully do this being self-taught or with a CS degree. But for me, I needed something relatively quick, and I needed something with structure because I knew self-taught would have been really challenging for me to feel confident in what I was working in. And then the skills that I find most useful in my everyday are not necessarily that I've picked up 4 new languages on my own, but that I can work efficiently as a developer, that I can collaborate with others in a way that makes sense. And ultimately I can, keep working on new features and driving our products. So some ways to work on learning these skills: again, consider contributing to an open source project. I do have a resource on the bottom of the doc. I've linked a couple communities, as one in Boulder and Denver to consider, and then Ruby for Good if you happen to code in Ruby. And then another one in there that goes through the process of doing a first pull request for an open source project. And then I sort of touched on this, but include skills other than new languages. So I think when you leave a boot camp, you've been so used to just having new things thrown at you that you think like, well, maybe I should learn 2 new backend languages and another framework. And I think that's good to do if you have a specific one in mind, or if you're applying to a specific role that you need a specific language, but also to include some of these other skills like working with the shell and GitHub that help make you more efficient and are going to allow you to be a little bit more independent as a junior engineer. And then start attending meetups in your area, ones related to what you code in or ones that you want to learn. One that I would recommend is the Women Who Code Boulder Denver monthly tech night. Again, I do co-host that with Jenn, and I hope to see some of you there. All right, so that's all of I have. I do have the resources linked if you have not gotten that yet. And then I've got how to reach me in the middle here, and this is sort of in order of how I'm most likely to respond. So if you Slack me, I will probably respond day of, and the other 2 I may take a little bit longer to get to. And then I would love to open it up to any questions that anyone has. Feel free to pop